My talk is going to be about risk, but a slightly particular kind of risk, systemic risks. And generally, what we want to protect is, in some sense, this very fragile sphere of human activity. So if you just remove everything that's not touched by humans on Earth, you get something like this: shipping lines, cities, people that you can't see. On the whole, it doesn't look like very much. Of course, the total mass of all our building, all our equipment and so on is pretty enormous from a human scale, but compared to Earth and the Earth system, it's still pretty tiny. But it's growing pretty fast, and it's getting enmeshed in these systems in all sorts of ways. Sometimes these systems harm us directly, like the current hurricanes. Sometimes we affect the systems in a bad way, like with climate change. And sometimes the co-evolution might go in very, very odd directions, as we're exploring in sort of more far-reaching things in this workshop. But in particular, we're interested in existential risk. How can this whole system go badly wrong? A very nice way of thinking about risks is this typology invented by my colleague Owen Cotton Barrett. So it starts by asking, how does it start? Where does whatever is threatening us come from? And how come we missed that that is a bad thing? So there are the natural risks. They don't dominate a risk profile that much, unfortunately, for us. It's human-caused risks that really have the most probability. In some cases, this might be because a few people do something they shouldn't be doing, and sometimes because a lot of people are doing it. Sometimes this is just accidents. We don't know what we're doing, so we might accidentally release gases that create an ozone hole. And sometimes we do know that maybe the carbon dioxide isn't such a hot thing, but I really want to have that nice flight. And some people actually like to see the world burn. Not many, fortunately, but there are some of them. And of course, sometimes we might have disagreements that lead to conflict. So these are the kind of generic reasons we might be generating a risk, that we're not just stopping it. Another problem is, of course, stopping it might be hard, even because it is a very large risk. There is something very powerful. A supernova, we can't shield ourselves against that yet. And sometimes it's because it's something that makes itself bigger. It's a cascading risk. It's something that spreads, like a virus, whether a computer virus or biological virus. And finally, for something, in order to actually be existential, it needs to either break our capabilities to continue as an advanced civilization, or stop other risks, or break our habitat or other systems we need to survive, or we have a more direct thing, that either something becomes ubiquitous, takes over our entire environment, like an artificial intelligence turning everything into paperclips or shareholder value, or it might be having some vector that seeks out or it might even be intelligent. Now, I'm not going to be able to talk about all of this. I'm going to kind of focus on a subset here on when things go wrong because there are many different parts. I'm going to look at systems and when they go wrong, why, and some ideas about how we can think about that in terms of existential risk. So, systemic risk, one of the classic examples is ecosystems. So, in the Pacific Northwest, we have this wonderful example of a kelp forest, where you have a rich nutrient web, where the kelp is really essential, and there are abalone shells, which are really nice for otters and human fishermen. And human fishermen felt that the otters were competing with them, so they started wiping out the otters. Without the otters, of course, there was more abalone shells. Unfortunately, otters also like sea urchins, and sea urchins like to eat kelp. So the result is an ecosystem dominated by sea urchin, and not much else. No abalone shells, nothing else. So this is one of those classical ecological crash stories. And another very big one is, of course, the collapse of the cod fisheries outside Newfoundland. Again, as fishing techniques got better, we could capture more fish. And before we knew it, we were reaping a lot of fish. The economy was booming up until the point where the ecosystem flipped to a state with very few fishes, and the fishermen went out of job. And it stayed there since. Fishing went down, but having this ecosystem with fewer cod is also a relatively stable state. Many systems are very complicated. This is a sketch of things involved in human aging. And you can argue that aging is also a systemic risk. All the parts of our body are essentially working as we should. It's very hard to point at any enzyme or piece of DNA and saying, that's doing it wrong. However, the overall effect is that over time we get various awkward problems. Bad chemicals accumulate, and the immune system gets weakened because it gets a lot of cells that can't do their jobs very well, etc., etc. This is partly because evolution hasn't optimized us for living very long. And of course, we can create even more complex systems when we deal with our food system and what we're eating. So this is a sketch of how the obesity epidemic works. And you don't really need to try to see anything, because I don't think you can even make out anything on that picture. It's just a mess. Some of it is biology, some of it is economics, some of it is sociology, and nobody really knows what's going on there. Another classic slide from the war in Afghanistan, many years old now, it's a classic. This explains what's going on. And when Donald Rumsfeld saw this, he said, "I seen the enemy. It's this slide." And this is, of course, how many real systems work. Everything is connected in complicated ways. There are feedback loops supporting and contradicting each other. And we want to steer the system, but it's going to resist us, and we're going to have a hard time even making out what's going on. Another classic one is, of course, the financial crisis. Again, you can make a long list of possible causes, but one interesting thing is just the connectivity of the economy. We have gotten an economy that is much more tightly connected and much more tightly correlated. So when something goes wrong, it spreads across the system very fast. Systemic risk is, of course, a favorite concept among the financial people, but that doesn't help them understand it very well. And of course, we can connect the economic system, the energy system, and food system by doing biofuel, and that means that now the energy prices and the food prices become correlated over time, which can lead to awkward problems when you get a price spike in oil, that leads to a price spike in food prices, and then you get rioting in the Middle East, which is one contributing factor to the Arab Spring. A bit of an unexpected side effect of making ethanol fuel subsidies in America. And of course, we have the Internet of Things that allows your refrigerator to participate in a denial of service attack against some software researcher in America because somebody didn't like what he was writing. And there are no incentives for the fridge manufacturers to make the fridge not help out in doing hacking. So we have an interesting problem that we create systems that are very unstable and cause a lot of trouble. Now, these systemic problems partly are linked because they're strongly interconnected, which means that the full system, not just some small part, reacts when there's an outside disturbance, or something internally happens. It might be just random, but it gets scaled up and causes the whole system to misbehave. And then we can flip it between different states that we might not like, either because the state itself is bad or because it's surprising. And it might be very hard to push the system back. And it's worth noticing that this interconnectedness is not bad. The globalization, interconnectedness of our human economy is a great way of actually keeping peace globally. It's a great way of getting more prosperous and safe. We're getting rid of a lot of risk this way because we get a more robust system. Except that when something fails, it might fail globally instead of locally. So generally, I like to define systemic risk as systems collapse despite all the parts working perfectly well. And it can spread from part to part of the system. And the connectivity, as I said, can both help it spread, but also allow buffering. Other parts of the system can pick up the slack. The internet is very resilient because you can route around damage. And many of these systems are adaptive. They change as a response to what's going on. And again, this is very helpful, except that you can get misadaptation, which leads to surprising misbehaviors. And it's very hard to predict. So I'm just going to rush through this because I know that it's early in the morning and we can always, during the lunch break or other breaks, discuss the fine details. But there are a bunch of stylized facts about why these systems behave like they do. The first one is obviously positive feedback. If you have a cascading failure spreading, for example, in a power grid, once part of the grid goes down, other parts get overloaded, and that overload grows. So the end result is that you amplify the change and it spreads. You can have positive feedback loops, like, for example, the polar ice cap, which normally keeps the Earth world cool. If it warms, it melts, and now the polar regions are darker, so we absorb more sunlight. So this is a common way of instability. One can analyze this in terms of bifurcation theory. I love dynamical systems myself, so I shouldn't allow myself to get carried away, but basically, when you change the parameter of a system, you can get sudden jumps in equilibrium conditions. Most of the time, we find things in an equilibrium position or in some attractor state. It's just that this attractor state can suddenly change when we change parameters. There is a really interesting aside, which I absolutely don't have time to get into, but it's worth thinking about, and that's Robert May's work on theoretical ecology and the stability of ecosystems. Back in the 60s and 70s, it was believed that if you had a diverse, randomly connected ecosystem, it had to be stable. And he proved in a beautifully short paper using a result from a random matrix and antenna theory that this is not generally true. Large systems, large ecosystems should be unstable. The cool thing about this paper is you don't really need to apply it just to ecology. He applied it to bags, and generally it seems to apply for almost any system. So the real question is, Robert, why is anything complicated stable? And the real answer is most complex and complicated things are not randomly connected. Very few important things in the world are totally random, because that's pretty useless. But we still do not fully understand how these internal processes actually cause that stability. This is a very hot area of theoretical ecology, and there is a lot of things going on. So we might learn very important things here, but we don't know what we're going to learn. There are other ways you can get tipping points, sometimes because of noise, sometimes because the system is trying to track change and cannot keep up, which is important because we're accelerating a lot of changes. We have cascades, as I mentioned, over the networks, and again, the kind of network matters a lot. And this, for example, means that typically you see power law distributions of how big outbreaks are. Most of the time they're very small, sometimes you get power outages or epidemics that cover the whole system. Networks can do a lot of other weird things. You can add the connections and they become less efficient. You get all sorts of weird game theory going on, of course, when agents are gaming on the network and interacting in a selfish way. And of course, you have issues about how quickly things can spread. Finally, of course, many of the human systems are deeply enmeshed in how our psychology works. Our cognitive biases make us misbehave in roughly the same way. There are social problems when we can't really tell a boss how bad the situation is, so we give him a slightly improved version, and he tells his boss a slightly more improved version. And eventually the CEO of the organization or the chancellor of the university, she thinks that everything is totally fine and makes commands and, based on this assumption. And then the process continues downwards because all these commands and orders are getting modified. The end result is, of course, a normal mess. We also have problems with how knowledge and information spread through our systems. Many of our institutions supposed to fix these risks are not joined up, which is sometimes actually a good thing, as we'll see. And of course, we are sometimes even accidentally making things worse deliberately because it might be good for us. So one thing I've been working on is a little project how risk models in insurance can make things work. They are essentially using risk models to calculate prices. What's the probability of a hurricane doing this much damage? That's useful to figure out the price for insuring a condo somewhere in Texas or the Caribbean. And then they make bigger decisions about how much risk to take based on the model of the total amount of risk. There is a certain degree of human understanding here. It's not just following the computer, but many older insurance people think that the youngsters are a little bit too much obsessed with their spreadsheets and believe a little bit too much these models, which are known to be perfect. But worse, there are also very relatively few catastrophe models. There are 3 main manufacturers and one got 75% of the market. Everybody uses them in the market, which means that they're going to act in the same way. So we did some work on modeling this, and it turns out, I wonder if you can see this, well, the green line, unfortunately, is a bit hard to see. So if you have a market with too little information, it's not going to work very well. You don't model the world very well, so as an insurance company, you don't apply your resources well, and you go bust. If you know it really well, the green line, which you probably can't see, but it goes straight up, that's the amount of profit the market is making. And basically, they're doing the right thing and they're getting rich. Now, the red line corresponds to really bad models. But the blue line corresponds to, see, very, very bad models. And you make much more money because we're really wrong about the world, but we're reaping in easy money what we think, because we're underestimating the risk. So the end result is we take too much risk, we don't know it, and suddenly something bad happens, and everybody loses. And since in a situation where you have few models, we're also going to be correlated. That means all the insurance companies are now in trouble. One can refine this to take cognitive bias and other things into account, but it shows the problem that you need to have a better understanding of risk to do this well. And understanding also how uncertain you are about your model of risk. And again, for rare events, we're very, very bad at doing this. And using modeling well is going to be a real challenge. So, to actually get to the topic of this workshop, could you get existential systemic risk? And I think there are two ways we could get there. One is something bad happens and our systems collapse. And now we're more vulnerable to new risks that emerge. And then they might, of course, harm us again. And now we're even more vulnerable. There are even fewer survivors, and they are even more precarious position. And eventually, a string of bad luck runs out and leads us to extinction. The other one is what Scott Alexander called a mold. That is that we actually have created this kind of social trap, where we constantly are attracted to states that have very low value. We don't die, but we keep on working without enjoying it, and we do it forever. So the connected disasters are interesting because they can happen both because the disasters are uncorrelated, we're just having bad luck, but increased vulnerability, or because we hook into each other. And if you remember my first slide of that with Owen's typology, you can look at what the points are where actually the disasters affect our ability to meet other disasters, and that's where we need to shore up systems. The Molochs are really tricky because they involve agents doing what's locally rational. So I might be doing things to make money, and if you don't make enough money, you won't survive in this competitive society, so you better make money too. And now everybody's competing with me, so I need to compete even more, and maybe give up some things that make life worth living. And then if you don't do that, well, then you're going to fall behind. So the end result is we're all working endlessly and throwing all the values under the bus. So this is an adaptive coordination failure. We're not coordinating well, and a lot of people spend a lot of time coming up with better ways of doing bad things. So this is a really interesting and sticky problem how to deal with. And I don't think it's well analyzed yet. Alexander's original Moloch essay is beautiful, but it's a start. It's definitely not a solution. Thomas Homer Dixon, on the other hand, has a much more elaborate model of how different actions come together. Again, I'm totally running out of time, so I don't have the time to get into it, but it's a beautiful way of analyzing, putting it into part. You can apply it, for example, to the food crisis. Similarly, Joseph Tainter has a classic model of how complex societies fall, partly because they get overly complex and you get diminishing returns. And again, fixing this problem is hard. It requires a lot of coordination, but we can actually model this and figure out ways of dealing with it. There are ways of handling systemic risk based on what we understand of dynamical systems, of networks and so on. And you can make lists. You can come up with all sorts of approaches. We can also apply that, actually, to the big systemic and systemic existential risks. There are ways around it. Sometimes they're fairly obvious. Make sure that we have a lot of resilience. Make sure that we prevent disasters that would make us more vulnerable. Sometimes it's a bit more subtle. We might need to maintain boundaries inside our social, economic, or technical systems so damage or influence don't spread too much. And a lot of this seems to be that the precautionary principle doesn't apply here because it's very hard to analyze this rare, possible, and complex event. But we can design systems for resilience instead. I think that might be the trick for actually avoiding systemic existential risk. Thank you. So I guess I have, what is it, 1 minute of questions?
You have, you vastly underestimated. Let's see if I'm on here.
Yeah, sure.
You have 30 minutes of questions.
30? Wow. Awesome. Well, questions? Yes?
Since you present, I'm not in this community, so forgive me if I'm wrong. Since you point at the trade-off between stability and connectivity, so what's your opinion, let's say, for the financial market or some other system? Should one go to the bottom line, try to disconnect?
It depends a little bit on what are we trying to achieve. So I think normally, I would say you want to have a global market because that's actually going to globally make us better off. Overall, having a more prosperous world is actually a tremendously good way of improving our resiliency, because having extra resources allows us to get around that. And I don't think it would be we would benefit if we just kept, let's say, our trade to within one continent. It would make the world globally safer. And if you say that, yeah, actually, global failures are so bad that we must never have them, in that case, you might want to go that far. But rather, you want to have the right kind of disconnection to make it harder to do the contagion. And you might want to do that, for example, by having diversity. You might actually, some people say you should add delays to the stock market. That works maybe against the high-frequency trading issue that causes one kind of instability. But you might want to also maybe have slightly different regulatory regime and admit that we're having this not because we think these regimes in themselves are the right thing. We just want to keep them different because the cost of that extra risk of getting too strong correlation actually is too high. That's going to be a tough thing to sell to people because it's obvious how you could optimize things, but you need a way of pricing it, either by having some fancy economical theory that actually allows you to do it, or actually by making that political decision. And this is, of course, always a problem in any system. Standardization is making technology work so well, but the more standardized our software is, the easier it is for computer viruses to affect all the system. It's a good thing that there are some holdouts using really weird versions of Linux somewhere. But that doesn't mean that everybody wants to use a really weird version. There is a cost to that. So actually figuring out who's paying for that and having somebody actually making that decision and standing for it, that's going to be a challenge. But it's more of a political challenge, I think, than a technical one. You and then you?
So I appreciate Owen talking about his work in Oxford, and you showed a slide on response. One of my bigger concerns is that this work gets communicated with other communities of researchers, including those who currently work on disaster response and preparedness. And sometimes the same word is used in different ways. So I hope that we would talk about preparedness and response in the same way as that profession. They've been around quite a while, and they're quite clear. The other word that sort of gets me a bit cross is resilience. Because it can be used in so many different ways. But there's one part of it I do really, obviously I'm working on to do with food system vulnerabilities. And so the part I'm particularly interested is where it's kind of almost beyond resilience. And that's, I think, what we're talking about, the shocks that are too big to be resilient to. Although some people include in resilience recovery or replacement.
So when in our work, we regard recovery as an important part of resilience. You can view it as kind of a triangular matrix. You have brittle systems that if you disturb them, they just break. And then you have systems that behave like steel. They resist the change very, very well. Or you have things like water, which just reshape themselves. Or they might adapt if they're a bit like yellow. And if that line, that's of course where you find different uses of resilience in different communities. And the word resilience is used and misused in endless number of times. A literature review found 40 different meanings of it. So it's really confusing. It's bad enough with systemic risk, where it's only about 30 different definitions. But yes, it's useful to try to define one's terms whenever talking. So this was a general overview. So but I think it's very well worth trying to think about what kinds of resilience do we want in our system. We obviously don't want to live in a brittle world, but do we want a world like steel or a world like water? That's already an interesting question, because there's some parts of the world that we actually might not want to be too flexible, and other, because we might flow away, and other parts that definitely we don't want to be too strong. So there's an interesting issue, philosophical too, about openness here. But let's talk more about that later. Your question?
Could you go back a few slides to the Alexander one?
Well, let's get to the questions, otherwise...
Christian.
Right, Christian from the university. So the thing you said about the precautionary principle at the end, it seems you got that wrong, because it seems your resilience argument is a precautionary argument. So you should spend resources on creating this resilience just to be sure. And that's a typical precautionary argument, right?
No, that's not what I'm saying. I'm saying the precautionary argument is typically, at least the more sensible version, is epistemic. If we don't know if it's risky, we should investigate the risk and see what we can do about it. But many of these systems have properties where the investigation is actually unlikely to produce enough really solid data. However, we can cheat. There is an important distinction between science and engineering. In science, we study a system, but we're not allowed to change it. We're not allowed to redefine the system outside our paper. If I study birds, I'm not allowed to replace birds with cyborg birds, because I would be a bad ornithologist. If I'm an engineer and want to make a flying thing, flapping wings turn out to be much harder than jet engines. So actually, that way of cheating is totally all right. That's good engineering. The best engineering is all about redefining and design.
But then, of course, you spend your resources on designing the engineering solution. So that's not the only.
Well, you need to understand the consequences of your design.
Point, right? So my main point is about those interested in the insurance model. So if you scale that up, that kind of thinking, and think about that existential risks are mainly, I totally agree with you on that point, driven by social factors. The problems are political rather than technical to make it happen, right? So you scale up, so the solution in the insurance market is that exactly what you said. You have the model, most people use the same model, that means that all the companies think alike. So if you want to scale that up to manage the political challenges of existential risk, you would need to have something that would make all people think alike in a similar way. So how do you deal with that? Because even if you think that you could have political powers of enforcing solutions, these powers will be dependent on enough popular support in order to be sustainable.
So it's a slightly different problem, but I think it's worth noting in the insurance case, one of the problems is that regulators are accidentally making people use fewer models, because that's more convenient for the paperwork. If everybody were using different models, which would actually produce less systemic risk, it would be more work for the regulators and they would cause more work for the insurance companies. So there is a convergence towards few models. Similarly, having a regulator making everybody think and act alike, that's of course a great way of getting a lot of systemic risk. So you have an interesting paradox here. We want to coordinate enough, but not too much. Over here.
I worked in the finance industry, I have been for many years. I think a major problem is that people focus too much on the regulation side of it and not enough on the local behavior with individual people trading. Because the reward systems, this is very obvious when you work with these guys in Wall Street. So, the reward systems are very local. So what makes me make money, what makes him make money, is just destabilizing the whole system. And it's not even good for, I mean, people think too little about how the effects of how they reward their traders, how that affects the entire company. And then the politicians can regulate all they want, but people are still going to find ways around it. Because, I mean, if I made $10 million and the company goes bankrupt, it doesn't matter. I'm still going to be a star, and I can just move to Goldman.
Yeah. So setting incentives in the right way, that's of course the key for quite a lot of these systems. And quite often people think it's easy to set incentives. They should talk more to economists to realize how subtle this can get. Insurance is much more stable than hedge funds, partially because the incentive structure is different. You don't get a great bonus by taking an enormous amount of risk. partially because it's very hard to tell how much risk you're taking, while in the hedge funds you get more strong effect. In the insurance world, you can get instabilities when the companies are instead taking the risks and maybe not playing the right when they game on the market. And setting this up so it actually works well is rather simple. If we had been thinking carefully when inventing email, we could have avoided spam. But now we made email so that it's for free to send email to anybody else. Which made total social sense back in the 70s when we were inventing these systems, because they were happening inside an academic institution. Using for advertising was kind of, why would anybody do it? The closest to an advertisement would be announcing a seminar sometimes. But of course, once you scale it up enough and you get self-interested agents that want to make money, you get spam. If you have added some form of micropayment or some cost to sending too many emails into the protocol level, so it got sent into the whole system by path dependency, spam wouldn't have existed. But that also shows the problem both for prediction and designing in a smart way. Because of course, in that social world where email was being defined, this was very hard to think of. If an economist had shown up and explained it, people might have done it. But they would probably just have dismissed that as a really weird assumption, because obviously you can't scale up email to work outside the department. So one of the great challenges, I think, for making systems that are stable and resilient by design is, of course, our abilities to predict are limited. We still need to make them, but we also need to design them in such a way that our very limited prediction abilities can be applied. A lot of that probably requires using multiple models at the same time. It's not just for insurance. Having multiple models of risk is actually quite useful. Not just for one risk, but also thinking about the bigger systemic risk, because we know we're pretty crappy at it, so we should be using multiple models and sample approach, because that has a slightly better chance of covering the different possibilities. And then we should, of course, expect that many of these systems actually will not work as intended, so we need to try to design it to be repairable. That's kind of part of Tater's worry about social collapse. Societies are not repairable. Could one design constitutions, if you at least started a new society on Mars, to make it repairable? That's actually a really interesting idea. Then, of course, how to retrofit existing societies, that's an even bigger challenge and probably much, much harder. Robin?
So, everything you just said, everything on the slide that we're looking at, they all look like things that you might want to do sometimes, but you're pretty sure other times you don't want to do them.
Yeah.
They're not things you always want to do. So, what do we know about when you should do what?
Yeah.
Is there any, like, morals? Do we really know anything, or do we just have a list of things we might want to do?
That's a great question. And the answer is, of course, well, once this has actually properly turned into a paper, perhaps after we've been chatting a little bit more over coming days and weeks, we will have a list. I do think we actually know a fair bit about when some of them are applicable. Sometimes about when they're possible, sometimes when there actually is enough information, and sometimes when we know that something definitely shouldn't be done. I think it's actually possible to map out, but right now on the slide, of course, I didn't have much space for it. So, for example, the thing about making risk externalities measurable and priced, well, you know a lot about that, and that's not easy at all. And in many cases, that might not even be possible, and I'd love to hear what the economics position would be and what we know about that. I know a fair bit about how to design dynamic systems and get the attractor states to behave themselves, and even detect when attractor states are getting unstable. So that's where we actually know how to do the design. But this is, of course, where we can actually be a bit of a magpies and borrow useful tools from different disciplines. Computer and engineering has been working rather hard on controlling complex systems. The main tool in the arsenal there tend to be abstraction barriers and modularity, which works, as we know historically, for some things and definitely not for others. But we can actually see where you can get a proper analogy of that in other systems.
Any further questions? Yes?
Yeah.
Based on your knowledge, what do you see being on this planet in the year 2183 years' time?
Well, this is a problem. The possibility space is very, very big. Basically, I like to argue that I tend to believe the future has heavier positive and negative tails than most people. When most people talk about the future, they imagine something like now, but with flying cars and a bit more pollution, maybe a cyborg president, and they are retired or something like that. I think, yeah, that's very close to the mean of the distribution. I believe that there are tails that lead to very, very bad outcomes. So in 100 years' time, I can totally imagine that, yeah, we're totally extinct. Perhaps because of the badly programmed superintelligence, perhaps because of something we can't even conceive, or that we actually done very, very well. We have enhanced ourselves, we've gotten the various forms of superintelligence, we're expanding out into space. The range is really big. So making a proper prediction is kind of pointless. You want to hedge your bets for the future. You want to work hard on getting some of the more obvious risks and more subtle risks done. So we reduce that tail. And then we have a much better shot at a really good positive tail. So I'm not going to be making a prediction about 100 years, because obviously this is getting recorded and I don't want to post you on
Anyone else? Laura?
So you mentioned just one conversation ago, computer systems and what can be done to reduce resilience and correctness there. You mentioned modularity and abstraction. You also correctly observed that sometimes this works and sometimes it doesn't. So from your perspective, when can you characterize when it works?
I would need to sit down and do a much more lengthy investigation there. Generally, a lot of it has to do with understanding the purpose of the system. If you actually have well-defined purposes for the modules, you can typically modularize very well. The real problem is many systems have to interact with a messy real world, especially a messy social world. The meaning of many technological systems are not set by the technology itself, but by how they get used in a kind of feedback loop. Twitter is a beautiful example. Hashtags were invented by the users of Twitter. And the point of Twitter is created by the users of Twitter. It's not inherent that it needs to be used for a particular thing, even though maybe the programmers believed it was good for one particular purpose. So that means that the modularization, in this case, in the case of Twitter, is of course a relatively simple system, at least at the core. You just want to send messages and catalog them. You can probably do that fairly well. On the more social side, of course, what meanings and importance it gets, that becomes much messier. In the case of Twitter, for example, privacy emerged as an issue. And I don't think the basic modularity of the system helps very much with that. Now, if you had designed the system saying, yeah, we're going to do this and we want to make sure privacy can be enforced here, you would need a different structure. So I think in general, and this is something I love to discuss more later on, is when you design systems, how open do you make them? Designing an open system is something we know very little about, because much good engineering is based on creating something like that steel construction that resists outside influences, typically by having a lot of extra material or extra strength or something that resists it. A lot of modularity is, again, working like that. You remove noise and signals, but sometimes you also want something that's easily upgradable, and typically we have this tension between ease of upgrade and a strictly defined safe system, especially when you get to medical applications and things like computer security. You have these nuggets of code that need to be very, very perfect and ideally proven perfect, but that makes them very hard to upgrade. I don't think this was a messy answer. Let's discuss that in the break.
Yes?
Would you expect, you touched very briefly on Tater's complexity theory and collapse, and would you like to expand on some ideas on how to actually counter that?
Yeah, so I have a bit of a libertarian bent, so I'm of course a bit concerned about the number of laws growing a lot. But that's of course mostly a sign of the growth of complexity in society. Societies are trying to solve problems. Groups of people are finding problems, and then they solve that by inventing institutions, rules, or other ways of organizing. Now, those extra things have a cost. Tater like to talk about as energy cost, which makes it sound like it's a very much of a natural science thing. I think that might sometimes be overblown. But there is certainly a cost on this extra complexity, but it also allows you to do a lot more nice stuff. Except, of course, that now you need to get more resources. And the classic example is the Roman Empire. In order to pay for all the nice things you gave to the Romans, you need to get more income, and for that you need to conquer Gaul, and then you need to, now you get a little bit more Romans, so now you need to conquer a bit more. And before you know it, you're standing over in Britain and wondering, why ever did you go to this island? And beyond some point, it's very hard to expand. And meanwhile, the cost just keeps accelerating. The legal system gets more complicated, and you have more people who are willing to exploit it in clever and devious ways, so you need to have systems that handle that. So eventually reach a point where it might be rational to make it less complex, but now you can't do what you previously did, and that typically leads to breakups. Or individuals realize, can't make do with this complexity, I'm opting out. And that's rational for me, and as soon as people start doing that, you also get a bit of collapse. Now, as Tainter wrote, he was kind of pessimistic that he was almost regarding this as a law of nature. I don't know whether this is a law of nature. It's not obvious that complex systems need to accumulate entropy at all. Complex adaptive systems, though, they have a limited memory capacity. They have a limited capacities in other computational domains. And they need to allocate that well. And if those capacities are full, you need to expand one way or another. So I do think actually expansion, getting more energy or more space or more people, fresh ideas, are necessary to keep the system somewhat stable. It might be that that expansion can be ridiculously slow. We have various examples in computer science where you actually can see that even logarithmic expansion is more than enough to allow systems to do interesting, useful tasks indefinitely. But this is something worth investigating much more deeply, I think.
You didn't mention wicked problems or wicked systems. Are those concepts something that you've engaged with, and do you find these concepts to be useful?
I like wicked problems, but they're also very hard to formalize, because one of the ways of defining a wicked problem is that we can't even agree what the problem is. And we can't agree what the solution looks like. My favorite example is the Middle East. People are not really agreeing on what the deep problems are, and many of the proposed solutions, other people at the table say, no, that's not the solution, you're just making it worse. Sometimes that might be because of divergent views, but quite often the really deep, wicked problems are, yeah, they are fundamentally not even problems in the normal sense. However, I wanted to keep the systemic risks because they're somewhat well defined. You can imagine wicked systemic risks. Many people would argue modern civilization is a wicked problem. There's something wrong with it. The different people are saying that there are different things that are wrong and totally disagreeing about it. Whether it's too much freedom or too little freedom, whether we're too far away from nature or too close to nature, and so on. So I think if we could just figure out a few practical things about systemic risk, that's a great start, because the wicked problems are always going to be with us. Even if we solve all the normal existential risks, even if we end up becoming super powerful post-humans, can reshape the universe at will, we're still going to be sitting there with our wicked problems and disagree very profoundly what that reshaping should be like. And that might actually get worse because we're so good at doing that. But first things first, I think we want to survive the century.
Thank you for all these fascinating questions, and thank you, Anders, for your talk.